Good evening, members. Thank you for joining us for this excellent debate tonight. Seeing no private business, I look first to the business of my librarian, Hannah Edwards, Lincoln College.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday night. You know, despite summer rates, it's lovely to see you all here. I have two pieces of business for you tonight, and the first is to tell you about all the speakers that we have coming up this week, and there are quite a few. So firstly, on Monday, we have both Joseph Nye, the former US Defense Secretary, who will be at 5 p.m., and then we have Bugsy Malone, who is a rapper, who will be ably interviewed by Rosie, rather than me or Matthew this time, at 8 p.m. So come along for those. On Tuesday, we have Kathleen Stock, who is a philosopher, and I thought I would mention that as well as the usual provisions, we also have welfare resources, and if you want to ask a question to her, you also have the opportunity to come up to the dispatch box and have a right of reply if you want to take that up. On Wednesday, we will have the Swiss ambassador. On Friday, we will have the Tees Valley Mayor, and also a very special panel, which is the Ethnic Minority Women in Foreign Service panel. So do come along, as there are some really brilliant ambassadors and other speakers in that. My second piece of business is to tell you that my parents are down this weekend, and although they came and watched me do an interview yesterday, they haven't come to tonight's debate. And I'm feeling quite sad about this. And then it reminded me of how, every week you all turn up, there's hundreds of you here tonight for tonight's debate, and then you don't all come to Library Committee, which is on Monday at 2:15 in the Goodman Library. And that makes me even sadder than the fact my parents don't love me. So please do come along this week if you want to resolve that problem. And with that, I remain Hannah Edwards, Lincoln College, and your librarian.
Thank you, Hannah. I now look to the business of my treasurer, Rosie Jacobs, St Anne's College. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Hannah, again for reminding us why you did not speak on the loved side on Thursday evening. Anyway, I have three pieces of business before you tonight. The first is that Finance Committee is at Monday at 3 p.m. in the Goodman Library. Hannah's parents will be there, but they will not be attending Library Committee, so... My second piece of business is that next week's debate will be This House Regrets the Commercialisation of Pride. It will be at the normal time on a Thursday, so I hope to see as many of you there as possible. And my final piece of business is tonight's floor prize is a 3-course meal and wine at Mamma Mia Pizzeria in Summertown. So another good one tonight. And with that, I remain Rosie Jacobs, St Anne's College, and your treasurer.
Thank you, Rosie. And finally, I look to the business of my secretary, Lewis Fisher, New College.
Good evening, members and extremely honoured guests. I have 4 pieces of business for you tonight. Firstly, these pieces of paper tell me the results of Thursday's debate. Sadly for the librarian and happily for the treasurer. On the motion, this House would rather be feared than loved, for the proposition 30 and for the opposition 108, mean that the motion failed. Secondly, socials this week, quite quiet, but next Saturday, a week today, the FA Cup final is taking place. And as a good football fan, I've got to have an event for that, so get yourself along. Third, I don't have a tale to regale you with about committees. Come to Bar Strategy on Thursday at 5 p.m. It's pretty self-explanatory. And finally, the interesting stuff, the debate cocktails for tonight. For the interventionists among you, the Libertini. That wasn't enough laughter. And for those of you who rather stand by and watch, Democracy on the Rocks. That's everything from me, so let's kick off with what promises to be a great night. So with that, I remain Lewis Fisher, New College, and your secretary.
Thank you very much, Lewis. The only business that I have tonight is just to explain a little bit about this debate and the format. We're very lucky to have some students from Harvard Political Union here tonight. They are one of our reciprocal societies, and we're very glad that they've made such an effort to come and partake in this debate. I trust that the union membership will give them a warm, warm welcome, and we hope to have a long and enduring partnership together over the next few years. And it's in that spirit that I look to the first speaker to open the motion tonight. The motion before the House is this House would fight for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad. And I look to none other than Maya Bodnik, Harvard, to open the case for the proposition. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to speak here tonight. Democracy is under attack around the world. In recent decades, authoritarianism has taken hold in the Philippines, Turkey, Nicaragua, and Thailand, while authoritarian powers China and Russia have grown stronger. The crisis of global authoritarianism came to a head last year when Russia invaded Ukraine and attempted to crush its democratic government. And looking forward, autocratic China poses a threat to Taiwanese democracy. Tonight, I am so proud to defend the motion, "This House would fight to defend democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law outside the West." I believe that the US and Western Europe have both a moral obligation as well as a strategic imperative to protect democracy globally. Before I get into my argument, I will introduce the opposition speakers. First, you'll hear from Matthew Dick, president of the Oxford Union. Matthew is a distinguished debater and is well known for his efforts to platform fresh voices here at Oxford. President Dick, I'm flattered that you've invited me to speak here tonight, given that I'm not a porn star or a transphobe. The second opposition speaker is Stephen Zunez, a professor of political science and the chair of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco. Professor Zunez believes in the live and let live doctrine of US foreign policy. Yes, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping get things wrong from time to time, but there's a lot of blame to go around. Professor Zunez was very excited when President Trump said, "You think our country is so innocent? We've got a lot of killers too." Now, some people say that Professor Zunez is a blame America first intellectual, but that's totally unfair. He also hates the UK and France. The third opposition speaker is a late substitution, Sultan Koker, the press and sponsorship officer for the union. Now, I don't know that much about Sultan, but his LinkedIn profile says, "I am an ambitious and able student with high GCSE grades and a strong interest in an array of subjects." Particularly history, languages, and literature. I possess powerful analytical abilities, as well as the ability to think uniquely and creatively. What a tremendous late addition to his side. After President Dick's first choice was arrested by the Pakistani government for elections tampering and political corruption. If LinkedIn is any indicator, my side will have our hands full as Sultan weaves together a speech combining world-class analytical abilities with clever literary allusions. By the way, no one can accuse Sultan of political corruption. He's never won an election. Last year, he ran for union secretary and lost. And he ran unopposed for Lincoln College JCR and still lost. The final speaker for the opposition is Peter Galbraith, A lifelong diplomat, Mr. Galbraith was the US ambassador to Croatia and served in multiple positions in the Middle East. He's one of America's foremost experts on nation building, with a track record of success wherever he goes. Ambassador Galbraith, the very stable democracies of Iraq and Afghanistan thank you for your service. Mr. President, these are your guests, and they are most welcome. Tonight, we are debating the foreign policy of Western nations. And as an American, I'll be focusing on the US. And you know you can trust America. Over the past 20 years, we've sent you leaders of the free world, ranging from George W. Bush to Donald J. Trump to George A. Santos. And we never get it wrong. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. As President Bush likes to say, mission accomplished. So in this debate, you'll be hearing a lot about liberal democracy. Democracy is a political system in which governments are chosen in free and fair elections, and all citizens possess the civil liberties necessary to inform themselves about and organize opposition to these governments. In contrast to the equality, accountability, and freedom of democracy, under authoritarianism, a small number of powerful people dictate policy with few checks and balances. I believe that liberal democracies like the US and the UK have a responsibility to defend democracy around the world. But what does it actually mean to defend democracy? I want to acknowledge that we're having this debate following 20 years of failed Western interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it is not the burden of the proposition side to argue in favor of nation building. The word defend in the motion implies protecting something that already exists. In the Middle East, the US did not defend existing institutions, but rather attempted to create new democratic institutions. No, thank you. Therefore, the proposition will argue that the US and its Western European allies should protect existing democratic regimes from authoritarian threats. In this debate, the proposition must prove that, on balance, it is beneficial for the West to provide military support to democratic states under attack by authoritarians, whereas the opposition must prove that this is not true and that this is a net negative. Today, Ukraine is ground zero for the West's defense of democracy. The continued supply of international military aid to Ukraine is critical to preserving democracy in the region. Looking forward, the next great challenge to global democracy is China's threat to conquer Taiwan. China would almost certainly triumph over Taiwan in the event of a bilateral conflict. However, if the US and its European allies commit weapons and soldiers to defend Taiwan, China can be defeated and democracy can be protected. I commend President Biden's explicit, renewed commitment to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. Now, my Putinist and Xi-loving opposition might tell you that intervention risks escalation. But the greater risk is that authoritarianism overtakes democracy as the dominant regime type globally. If the US and Western European states are too afraid to stand up to Russian and Chinese aggression, these authoritarian regimes will be emboldened to conquer more territory, just as Hitler was during World War II. Neville Chamberlain thought that Hitler would be satisfied with just annexing the Sudetenland, but then he seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Poland. And then his eyes moved to France and the UK. And we all know what happened next. We cannot make the same mistake and expect that Putin will magically end his territorial ambitions after conquering Ukraine, or that Xi Jinping will kick up his feet and call it a day after taking Taiwan. Crimea is a more modern example supporting this point. After Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, President Obama and his Western allies responded with weakness. They imposed sanctions on Russia, but refused to provide offensive military aid to Ukraine. This enabled Russia to annex Crimea, forcing its 2 million citizens to live under Putin's authoritarian regime. Emboldened by the inadequate Western response to Crimea, Putin invaded Ukraine again last year, this time with the bolder aim of conquering the entire country. President Zelensky of Ukraine said it best. If the world had punished Russia for what it did in 2014, there would be none of the horrors of the invasion in Ukraine in 2022. The cases of Crimea and Nazi Germany show that Western weakness empowers authoritarian leaders to seize more land and provokes further aggression. If the West does not protect Taiwan, this could encourage China to conquer more territory in the South China Sea, impacting nations such as the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Similarly, if the West stops sending military aid to Ukraine, Putin could be emboldened to forge ahead with his plan to recreate the Soviet empire. The West has a moral obligation to prevent the spread of authoritarianism around the world. The US and Western European countries were founded on the principles of freedom, equality, and the rule of law. We must take a stand to protect these values. Defending democracy is not only a moral imperative, it's also a strategic imperative. If more countries fall under the sway of authoritarian powers such as China or Russia, this could diminish American and British influence globally. For all these reasons, I am so proud to propose the motion that this House would fight to defend democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law outside the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for that fine speech. Since I've perhaps very selfishly given myself the first opposition speech, I now must yield the chair, and I'd like to yield the chair to the ex-president, Lady Margaret Hall, Victoria Schofield.
Sorry, long time since I've done this. It is now with great pleasure that I call on Matthew Dick, President, to oppose the motion.
In 1989, Francis Fukuyama famously posited that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of history was upon us. His argument was threefold: that history records the struggle between ideologies, that in the ideological battle between liberalism and communism, liberalism has won, that it would inevitably expand, and that this would constitute the end of history. While Samuel Huntington and others criticized this argument for the fact that it was naive in thinking that democracy would inevitably expand, there's one crucial claim that Fukuyama makes that has gone unchallenged for 30 years, and that unchallenged nature must end tonight. It is the claim that democracy should expand against the other, whether this other be Cold War Sovietism, whether it be Chinese communism, or whether it be, more recently, people like Huntington have said, Islamic fundamentalism. Well, the end of the Cold War was the end of the US-USSR bipolarity. The ideological bipolarity between democracy and Fukuyama's other remains as strong as ever. The proposition must maintain that dichotomy, as advocating for the fight of these values necessarily implies a worse opposing enemy. In my speech tonight, I hope to convince you of three very simple things. First, that democracy, liberty, and the rule of law are not in themselves values we can confidently and morally defend over a formless other. Second, even if these are values that should expand, that military action will never achieve this, and in fact inherently undermines the values themselves. And finally, that there exists a solution to foreign policy that will do far more to defend our democracies. I entirely agree with what Maya says. I entirely agree that what's happening in potentially Taiwan and Ukraine is a disgrace, but I entirely reject the assertion that she and the proposition must make that to fight for these values is the solution, because it falls by moral triumphalism, and that is the cause of what we've seen happening in Ukraine, as I'll later prove in my speech. But first, it's my duty, and indeed my honor, to introduce you to the proposition speakers. You've first heard from Maya Bodnik from Harvard. Now, having heard her speech, I'm under no surprise that she's speaking on the proposition, on the side of aggressive foreign military intervention. Indeed, having met me merely days ago, having hopped off a plane on Thursday night, she's already launched a near-ballistic tirade on my character and my term. Sultan, who subbed in last night, has already been slandered on the basis of his LinkedIn, and I will tell you, Maya, that he did not run unopposed, he was opposed, and he lost nobly, but I will not stand by. I will not stand by in this House I shall not stand by in this house separate from the university, unlike the HPU, which shields itself in Harvard. We are an island, and an aggressive and American university is coming for us, and that is something that we must stand against tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, I fear that she might be planning to overthrow me, as I saw her at dinner get on very well with her fellow teammate, Ambassador John Bolton. And if she does happen to be planning a coup d'etat, she need look no further to him than for advice. He said, ladies and gentlemen, he said in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, and I quote, "As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and we should admire him for that." In fact, we're incredibly lucky to have Mr. Bolton with us tonight. He's made an incredibly strenuous and long journey from America, and he really is the world expert. Indeed, the list of countries that he has fought for democracy in is rivaled in its fullness only by his magnificent moustache. And speaking between the two Americans, we first have Fawzia Koofi, who's an Afghan women's advocate and former vice president of the National Assembly before the fall of Kabul. And after her, Mr. Ryan Selou, who is the former foreign minister of Estonia and was one of the most forceful supporters of Ukraine. What he and Fawzia have in common is a wholehearted dedication to their causes, which is truly admirable, and we're very lucky to have them. Something which is perhaps a rarity in the Oxford Union, between the hacks trying to claim dubious manifesto points and former illustrious presidents making a mockery of themselves by lying in Parliament. Thank you all for your long journeys to be part of this debate. We are very honoured to have you. The proposition's case that you've just heard and will continue to hear rests on the moral claim that democracy can expand by a fight, and crucially, that it ought to. To doubt this logical leap, we need only look at the track record of when America has tried, and when America and its allies have tried to fight for democracy. The history of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya makes one seriously question to the extent to which the values that America and its allies fight for are the values that we see enacted in their actions. And this is not merely a problem for Western hypocrisy. If you read Putin's pseudo-academic articles on the invasion of Ukraine, he defends it as a democratic exercise to liberate Russians in Ukraine from foreign control. I think if anything can be learnt from the last century, it is that an awful lot of harm can be done by those who proclaim to be fighting for liberty, for the rule of law, and for democracy. And that is something that we really need to uncover tonight. The obvious response to this, no doubt, is, of course, that democracy that Putin's talking about is one which is ushered in by tanks, bombs, and the destruction of innocent life, things which seem anathema to our conception of Western liberal democracy. However, this is a response that the proposition loses the ability to make as soon as they sanction those same tanks and those same bombs to destroy those same innocent civilian lives. And yet they ask us to believe that they, in fact, are the good guys, that their democracy is the democratic one, their freedom free, and their laws just. At the crux of the proposition's case is a paradox. The ends they praise are diametrically opposed to the means through which they advocate their achievement. And this brings me to my second argument tonight, that even if democracy ought to expand, that it cannot under the terms of the motion. To try to wriggle free from this paradox, the proposition will tell you that the ends justify the means. I tell you that the means undermine the ends. For lying at the bedrock of the values of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law is one very simple principle that we must accept, that even when an outcome is against our own wishes, we will be able to accept it as legitimate. Whether that is accepting a government as legitimate that you didn't vote for, or respecting the rights of your neighbour, or even accepting a court ruling against you. This is something that is really at the bedrock of liberal democracy. And simply put, this principle cannot be imposed by military force, which seeks to destroy the very opposition that is so crucial to the functioning of that liberal democracy. This country became a liberal democracy 100 years before our French counterparts, not primarily because of our intrinsic superiority, but because unlike our bloodless revolution, the French Revolution sought to build democracy on the beheaded corpses of the nobles who opposed their idea of liberal egalitarianism. A Manichaean chasm was created between la patrie, the nation, and l'ennemi du peuple, the enemy of the people, whereby the former were glorified and the latter killed. When the response to opposition is not rational debate, but the destruction and alienation of that opposition as the evil other, we should little doubt why we move away from the values of 1789, the very values of the proposition praised tonight, and creep inevitably towards the authoritization of Robespierre. When we fight in a foreign land, democracy is not ushered in by the consent of the civic body, but rather those elements that disagree with our conception of democracy are banished from the social contract, attacked and excluded from the benefits and promises that liberal democracy offers. I therefore hardly find it surprising that under these circumstances, when those enemies dismantle that democracy, it is in the same way it was established, by force. And don't just take my word for it. Just look at the fall of Kabul, the collapse of democracy in Iraq, and the unification of communist Vietnam, all just months after the withdrawal of troops. The bar for democracy, liberty, and justice is a high one. It rests upon the fragile acceptance of these values over our own interests. Even in established democracies, this is clearly under threat. I take the events of January 6th, 2021 in America as an immense warning shot as to the fragility of our own democracies. And if we recognize that fragility, we would be foolish to conclude that we have the capacity to brashly extend by force what is already in decline. And the proposition tonight must accept some responsibility for that decline. It is them who have dragged the values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law through the mud on the battlefields on which they suggest we fight, by using these values to justify the very interventions that undermine them. If your most visceral encounter of freedom and democracy is death and destruction, I highly doubt that you'll be convinced it's a good thing. I'm afraid the other side is the side for intervention. Moreover, the sharp battle that the proposition creates between those shining cities on a hill and those dark, amorphous anti-democracies entrenches the enemies that the proposition sees before it. In 1992, the possibility of Russia embracing liberal democracy was seriously spurned by Bush's State of the Union speech, in which he declared, and I quote, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." The moral triumphalism of those words added an ace card to the enemies of democracy by presenting a transition to democracy as an American victory and therefore a defeat to the Soviets. The continuation and eastward expansion of NATO, an alliance designed solely for the purpose of defeating the USSR, must be attributed some responsibility for the entrenchment of violent nationalism in Russia and the subsequent invasion of Ukraine. So finally, I would like to suggest an alternative, that we should fight not for the advancement of normative principles, but rather we should fight solely to protect the sovereignty of the state. Historically, democracy has blossomed not when it's been fought for, but when the expansionist ambitions of other states have been checked. The rise of the democracy in post-Soviet states was not a result of US fighting, but because authoritarian rule had collapsed. The Second World War began, not as Maya says, to defend democracy, otherwise it would have begun many years earlier, but in order to halt the German illegal invasion of Poland. And this is preferable for the exact reason that fighting for democracy is not, because it is morally neutral. Tonight I've asked you to question the moral justification that the proposition's case relies on. But even if you don't want to question it, I think that the last 30 years of foreign policy, from Libya to Iraq and Afghanistan, has compelled the West to question its own morality. One need look no further than this existential loss of all moral security on the part of the US and its allies to explain the apathy of NATO to intervene in the Russian war of aggression. So when you're walking through those doors tonight, do not be fooled by the proposition that a vote for them is a stand against Putin's Russia, a stand for democracy. A vote for the proposition is a vote to morally sanctify an ideological system that has done so much to create the harms of this world and is intellectually bankrupt to respond. I'm an ardent believer in democracy. In fact, so ardent as to realize that democracy cannot be achieved through armed force, because democracy is at its essence a voluntary act of free will. If democracy can only survive by forcefully submitting opposition to its will, then it has already been killed. Its blood is on the hands of the proposition and not the foreign regimes they rail against. I beg you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the President very much indeed for his speech, and I now hand the chair back to the President.
Thank you very much to the ex-President, Lady Margaret Hall. And now I look to the next speaker to continue the case for the proposition side, Fawzia Koofi. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this chance to share my cause and my story and to tell you why is it important to support democracy. I think there is a fine line that this House failed to recognize between colonized foreign policy and protecting values and protecting the principles of democracy. Until now, this House and the world has not witnessed any other form of government that substitutes democracy. Democracy is the only way forward for implementing the policies on the basis of which human rights of human beings are protected, principles of human beings and human rights are protected. This is so true in the case of Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, people of Afghanistan stood by democratic values. They risked their lives. Women of Afghanistan stood in the front line, side by side with their international allies to protect not only democracy for themselves, but global security. For the past 20 years, women of Afghanistan, people of Afghanistan have taken enormous level of risk to protect the global security, to protect their rights. However, it was the world, it was our wrong politics who failed democracy. It was not the people of Afghanistan that failed democracy. People of Afghanistan went to the polling stations, risked their lives to cast their votes. However, it was our wrong politics that people's vote from the ballot were never actually counted because we had a colonized view. Because there is that narrow line, the fine line between intervention and support was missed. We must stand with the nations to support them in fulfilling their democratic rights. Mr. President, I see that the world has become very radical in their views. There is an Eastern radicalization who believe that the Western world is so progressive, that the Western world do not stick to the values. And there is the Western world who believe the Eastern world is not pro-education. The Eastern world is conservative. That middle ground is shrinking. The third room is shrinking. It's a common responsibility of us, the global community, to provide people the space to create their third room. None of these perspectives of radicalized views of East toward West and West toward East is right. There is a third view, and the third view is that we can live together in coexistence, in harmony, only if we respect each other's values, only if we give each other the chance, which was not the case in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the case of Afghanistan became a matter of domestic politics, of the superpowers. Instead of looking what is best for the country, what is best for the people of Afghanistan, they looked at what is best for their own country. As a global citizen, we have a responsibility to protect rule of law and order in the rest of the world. I believe if the world did not fail in Afghanistan, the Ukraine situation would have not been where it is now. By pulling the way they pulled the troops from Afghanistan, the West paved the way for the war in Ukraine. President Putin or any other never dare to intervene the way they did in Ukraine if Afghanistan was not in the hands of Taliban. The world only has a security lens toward the situation. Mr. President, I'm sorry to say that as long as we continue to only have a security lens to the situation, and we do not regard human rights, women's rights, civic liberties as a matter of security, we will continue to fail our global values. So therefore, it's a common responsibility for us to stand with those global values. In the case of Afghanistan, this issue of security lens unfortunately resulted in the return of Taliban, because the world created a narrative for Taliban that they are the one who would defeat the rest of military extremist groups. We fail to forget that under the Taliban first rule in Afghanistan, that Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. We assigned a military extremist group like Taliban in the Doha deal signed on the 29th of February between the United States and the Taliban. We assigned the Taliban to take responsibility of the global security. We assigned them to fight Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and other military extremist groups. We forgot that they are the one hosting these military extremist groups. And after Taliban returned to power last July, the leader of Al-Qaeda was killed in Kabul, Ayman al-Zawahiri. That's a proof that only looking at from a security perspective, without working for the values, democracy, without listening to the people, without empowering the people in those nations, we will continue to fail. The world promoted two narratives with Taliban. The first narrative was Taliban will defeat the rest of military extremist groups. And the second narrative was that Taliban have changed, that they are Taliban 2.0, that they are pro-woman, that they are moderate, that they have changed. The rest of the world asked Taliban to protect women's rights and human rights, while in the Doha agreement signed between United States and Taliban, never they mention one word in support of human rights and women's rights and democracy. This is a failure in our parts. This is a failure for us to recognize that as much as security is important, that much sticking to these values and global principles are important. If you see the Doha agreement, nowhere it's mentioned that women's rights, democracy are important. And in my argument with American diplomats, when I asked them, why did you not ask Taliban, why did you not hold them accountable for their deeds on suppression of women and human rights in Afghanistan? Their response was that we negotiated our own issues with Taliban, you go and negotiate your own issue. As if divided the issues, security, withdrawal from Afghanistan was their issue, women and human rights was our issue. What happened to our common values? What happened to the principles on the basis of which the international community announced that they are going to Afghanistan to help people of Afghanistan achieve democracy? What happened to our promises? When we were left alone, we felt betrayed. The easy path was for international community to look at what their domestic politics interest is and to withdraw from Afghanistan the way they did. After the Doha agreement was signed with Taliban, I went to negotiate with them in a good faith, with a hope that we will be able to agree on a coexistence, that we will be able to agree on a political path that will restore the values that people of Afghanistan fought for, invested blood and treasure for. But by then it was too late, because the Taliban thought that they are the victory forces, that the United States dealt with them on a security agreement, that they see no need to engage with people of Afghanistan. I believe as long as we continue to ignore the people, the situation in Afghanistan will continue to happen in the rest of the world. So therefore, the more we focus on a colonized foreign policy and involve the regional geopolitics without ensuring that democracy, that people's power, that people's will is important, there is no difference between us and those military extremist groups. We all have they both have one thing in common: security approach, and not rule of law, and not constitution, and not human rights, and not principles of universal principles. During the negotiation, the Taliban were so proud of their agreement with Americans. They told me that they have agreed with Americans on everything, and they don't see the need to talk to us. Americans forgot the people of Afghanistan. They forgot their partners. They forgot the women of Afghanistan that stood with them side by side, courageously fighting for their rights. They thought security is a matter that they should talk. The rest, human rights, women's rights, future of democracy, governance, it is for women. It is for people of Afghanistan to negotiate. In the last 20 years, people of Afghanistan have proven that they are pro-democracy. I remember when there was voting, people were traveling from the areas which was controlled by Taliban, and they were casting their votes. When they were casting their votes, their fingers were inked, because that was the only means of voting, manual voting. When they returned to their villages, Taliban saw their fingers were inked, they cut their fingers. They punished them for voting. Is that what we want to do? We punish people for standing with democracy? We punish people for standing with rights? No, we shouldn't. Despite that, people took the risk to exercise their rights. We gave Afghanistan, a country so much in support of democracy, in support of a normal life, people who deserve to live in dignity. We gave it to a group that has taken now the people of Afghanistan in hostage. They don't let women exercise their rights because they're afraid of women's power. They're afraid of women's rights. These groups see women, these military groups, centered in security, see women as their enemy. That's why we have to stand in the right side of the history. The right side of the history is no alternative for democracy. We must support people in fulfilling their democratic rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. I now look to the next speaker to continue the case for the opposition, Professor Stephen Zunez. Hear, hear.
Thank you for the organizers. It's a real honor to be before this unique and amazing, prestigious body. And thank you for bringing this question before, because it's a very important one. I want to begin by making clear I stand in solidarity with those struggling for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad. I have actually been active in my human rights efforts around the world, regardless of the autocratic government's relationships with the United States. What I question is the use of military force, that such blunt autocratic instrument can be successful in the delicate task of defending and developing these principles. I question the assumption that there aren't better non-military alternatives. And I raise concerns about the moral objectives being compromised by power politics. I would argue that it is naive to believe the rhetoric we hear from the leaders of the United States, Britain, and many other Western nations that they actually are committed to these principles in the non-Western world. The most prominent Western defenders of the use of force tend to themselves be strident supporters of dictatorial regimes and occupation armies when they're allied with the West. Even today, under President Biden, 57% of the world's dictatorships receive arms from the United States. As a result, Western nations, particularly the U.S., which has the primary power projection capabilities for military interventions, are in no position to take leadership in this area. Before we start talking about fighting dictatorships, we should stop propping up dictatorships. Before we consider fighting for freedom and democracy, we should stop supporting those who are oppressing it. I have nothing but the greatest respect for our previous speaker and her comrades in Afghanistan. But the U.S. was not, I would disagree, saying it was weakness in standing up for the Taliban for the disaster had happened, but the fact that we supported these drug magnates, these warlords, these ethnic militia and others, and not Afghan civil society. Indeed, I question whether the Taliban would have come to power in the first place had during the anti-Soviet war, the United States hadn't sent 80% of its aid to the Hekmatyar faction, the extremists, which later allied with the Taliban. Even in the case of Ukraine, where clearly, I think we'd all agree, we are on the right side, there's some questions, serious questions about U.S. motivation. How can Biden, for example, point out the illegality of a country invading another on false pretenses when, as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he played a major role in authorizing the invasion of Iraq on supposed having weapons of mass destruction? How can Biden say targeting Ukrainian civilians is a war crime while arming Israel and Saudi Arabia and defending their bombing of civilian population centers? How can Biden correctly note that no country can unilaterally change its boundaries or expand its territory by force, while his administration is the only one in the world to have formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan region and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara, both of which were seized by military force in contravention of the United Nations Charter and a series of UN Security Council resolutions. I recall being in the University of Melbourne in a panel with Gareth Evans, who many people see as the intellectual architect of the so-called responsibility to protect. He was defending his critical role in convincing NATO to enter the Libyan civil war in the early phases at a time when less than 500 civilians had been killed by Gaddafi's forces. Well, I have the temerity to point out that as Australian foreign minister, he was a big supporter of the Indonesian government, supporting the arming and training of the Indonesian armed forces, which were responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 East Timorese in the occupation that was still going on at that time. He was even covering up for war crimes. At the close of the panel, he went up and started this expletive-laden tirade, tore off my conference badge, and threatened to punch me in the face. I realized perhaps he had a responsibility to protect his reputation, but I didn't realize it was an Australian rules conference. And similarly, you look at the U.S. and Britain, who are major backers of Egypt, of repressive Gulf monarchies, of other autocratic governments in that region, trying to justify the illegal, unnecessary, and predictably disastrous invasion of Iraq in the name of promoting democracy. Oh, what we've seen the results. This has enabled tyrants and their apologists throughout the region to claim that any support for oppositionists is simply an excuse for hegemony and the destruction of their societies. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that Bush and Blair did for democracy in the Middle East what Stalin and Brezhnev did for socialism in Eastern Europe. No police department in a democracy can get away with enforcing law so selectively, so why should our governments? Now, I am not arguing that a government must be morally pure or without contradictions before acting, nor am I denying that a government can sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reasons. However, Western nations cannot effectively advocate for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law as long as they only do in cases where the government in question does not play along with Western prerogatives. This plays right into the hands of Putin, other autocrats, and their apologists. Not only has it resulted in much of the global South refusing to come out in support of Ukraine, but such selective intervention strengthens rather than weakens the very reactionary nationalistic tendencies that threaten the very principles we claim to uphold. In any case, as we saw in Libya, the use of military force usually makes things worse. Indeed, the empirical data shows that so-called humanitarian intervention on average increases the rate of killing, as the perpetrators feel they have nothing to lose and the armed opposition see themselves as having a blank check and no need to compromise. Take the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo. While Serbian counterinsurgency campaign against Kosovar guerrillas was indeed brutal, It was no worse than what the Turks were doing to the Kurds at the same time with Western support and other counterinsurgency operations. The wholesale ethnic cleansing came only after NATO ordered the withdrawal of OSCE monitors and began the bombing. And the terms of the ceasefire agreement pretty much split the difference between the original demands by NATO at the Rambouillet meeting prior to the war and the counteroffer by the Serbian parliament, raising the questions as to whether an agreement could have been negotiated without war. And ironically, the world ignored a decade of nonviolent struggle by Kosovar independence led by Rugova and other moderate democratic nationalists, intervening only after the rise of the violent, corrupt, and chauvinistic Kosovo Liberation Army, which has ruled the nations for most of the period since. The good news, however, is that there are nonviolent alternatives. A study by Freedom House a few years ago showed that of the nearly 70 transitions from authoritarianism to some degree of democracy in recent decades, nearly 3/4 were through democratic civil society groups engaged in strategic nonviolent action. Only 2 cases were through foreign military intervention. It was not NATO that brought down communism in Eastern Europe. It was Polish dock workers, Czech intellectuals, East German church people, Estonian folk singers, and millions of others, ordinary citizens who faced down the tanks with their bare hands. It was not 11 weeks of NATO bombing that brought democracy to Serbia, but a nonviolent student-led movement which mobilized the population against a stolen election. And I know the leaders of Otpor, I've worked with the leaders of Otpor, the bombing set back their cause. They opposed the bombing because it got people to rally around the flag, and that's one of the big dangers of military intervention. The data, yes, go ahead.
Do you not recognize that the Central Intelligence Agency may have had something to do with funding and supporting the Solidarity campaign in Poland?
The foreign aid, the limited aid from Western governments to these opposition groups has had very little impact. The study by Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and others have showed, if anything, it's been used as propaganda by the regimes to try to discredit them. Indeed, the Otpor people, in hindsight, wish they had not accepted Western aid because they thought in balance it actually hurt their cause. The data also shows that when dictatorships are overthrown through military force, they become only less than 10% of the time do they evolve into stable democracies within the next 5 years. By contrast, dictatorships overthrown through nonviolent action, not all of them, but a majority are stable democracies within the next 5 years. Military means brings martial values, brings hierarchy, a hierarchical authoritarian structures as militaries are. Nonviolent action by civil society is a more pluralistic kind of thing, a lot more give and take, and it serves as a model of a more democratic society to come. The message that power comes from the barrel of a gun is not a good way to start a democracy, and the historic data shows this. In conclusion, the best way we can advance democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad is to stop arming and supporting dictatorships and foreign military occupations, support indigenous, nonviolent pro-democracy struggles, and challenge those who would use these noble ideals as a cover for militarism and imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that fine speech. I now look to Ermes Reinsalu to continue the case for the proposition. Hear, hear.
The Union is privileged to be here. Last speaker so kindly reminded Estonian singers. Well, before these singers, as I am coming from Estonia, we had a period of Nazi and communist occupation, which costed to my nation 1/5 of our population as a demographic loss. 1/5, before the singing revolution. Mr. President so kindly referred that these weapons we are giving to Ukrainians will making also in harm to civilians, as this is a cruel rule of law, we know. But let me put to this perspective. If Putin ends the war and gives order to his soldiers to end the conflict, the war is over. If Ukrainians will end the war, it will mean annihilation of Ukrainian nation and statehood, intent what Putin has not made any secrecy. The Russian peace for Ukrainians would mean a genocide. After Irpin and Bucha, I visited the places, I spoke with victims, with investigators from Ukrainian side, with international lawyers, and I drafted Estonian Parliament resolution. It was a first world Parliament resolution that this war is a genocidal war. And we made a call to all world parliaments to recognize it as a genocidal war. And you know, only 15 countries did it. President Macron, in last April, very wisely in his context, stated, we can't do it. Because then, if we recognize it as a genocidal type of war, we need to act more under the Convention Against Genocide. And it means escalation. And I do not, referring to him, if this is something we want. If something is hypocrisy, I would say this is hypocrisy. So there are three arguments for the actions against dictators, against totalitarianism. The first, as I mentioned, is a humanitarian one, to end human sufferings, to end genocide, to end the crimes against humanity, because we can't get these people's lives back. And we have seen, if we're speaking all these conflicts, if we're speaking about the Ukrainian war, how it has spread and caused a mass of human sufferings. Second argument is a security argument and rules-based world argument. An archipelago of democracies in a global perspective is diminishing. Our share in the world and our world understanding, if we're looking militarily, economically, demographically, it's diminishing. And it means that we stand for the rules-based world order. If we accept that the borders of countries could be chosen and changed by the power of tanks, it means that we will face the future of our children and grandchildren as an eternal war and suppression. And the third argument is a moral one. It's about us. If we look of the Ukrainian war to the mirror, we, Western people, will we feel shame or not? Were we the generation, as was earlier referred, of Churchill or Chamberlain? The one thing is truly that our actions should be based on the international law basics and principles. It's clear, evident. Secondly, that we should understand, do we have the might to act? And it is a moral cowardice if we do have a might, but we do not act. And the example of appeasement is a Russian aggression war against Ukraine. And I will stay very clear that if the West has been more determined in the willpower, in the actions, this war could be avoided. During the siege of Kiev, I was together in Kiev with President Zelensky, and he said, you need to act because it is your moral obligation, your moral burden. After the Georgian war, you know, there was 0 sanctions against Russia. After the 2014 war and annexation of Crimea, there were minor sanctions, and Russian economy got used with that. And President Poroshenko, September 14, went to US Congress and asked for weapons. And President Obama gave a check to $50 million and said, we are going to send blankets to Ukrainian soldiers. Poroshenko told to Congress, nobody fights for their homeland with blankets. So the case is that, vice versa, we haven't done enough for freedom, for ending the genocide, if we're speaking, resisting Putin. Looking at the economic sanctions, well, IMF is for this year making a prognosis that Russian economy is making a rise, 0.3%. And last year, economic loss to Russian economy was 2%, and Ukrainian economic loss was 30%. Russia, during the last year, got historical net profit from the oil and gas business, 28% more than before the fall of the last stage of war. You know, there are 13 Russian banks de-SWIFTed from the SWIFT operational banking system. And you know how many Russian banks there are altogether as financial international institutions? More than 300. It's a joke. So we haven't used our might as an economic power against Russia. What about weapon aid? Germany gave 3 more per capita in relation to GDP military aid to in a Kuwait operation when they have done during the year. US 2 times more to Kuwait operation. And looking to the perspective that there is a false myth that our shelves are out of weapons, this is untrue. We have given around 5% all combined together of our LMRS, of our tanks, of our howitzers. Only 5%. And it's comparing to Russian military might about 10% what Russians do have. So in a basis of military aid, let's put it to the European Union perspective. European Union, during the year, all the help to Ukraine is less than 10% when European governments during the last year gave to the citizens to ease the energy burden of the households and companies. So these are the perspectives, if we look. So my basis is that appeasement and cowardice and economic interests have encouraged the beast, have encouraged the aggressor, and this conflict has turned to a war. Now this is a regional war which actually is not a world war, but a war of world, where all the world countries are in a way or another involved or influenced. And our view is that if you sleep eyes wide shut and believe that things will turn down by themselves, the time is working against you. The time is currently working against Ukrainian people who have lost their lives, who are currently under fire. And we need to change the paradigm. The paradigm that we need to invest as much as it needed to losing of Russia and victory of Ukraine. Because first, it is the argument from the humanistic perspective, and Ukraine is now having a freedom fight on the very clear international law, UN Charter Article 55, basis of self-defense of independent country. Secondly, it is a security argument. If we can imagine anyhow that the outcome of this war will be ambivalent, or somehow even interpreted as a Putin's victory, it means eternal security chaos all over Europe. And the new dictators, the new aggressors and oppressors are looking with the greatest interest, also the President, what history is now made by us, either our activity or our passivity. And thirdly, there is a moral argument. Who we are, for what we stand. Are we worth of these values? We are very proud, in a warm halls to speak. Are we capable, morally, to accept that our leaders will make phone calls to a person who commits genocide, to a modern Hitler, or this person, Putin, belongs on the tribunal as a war criminal? And it's very sad to say that G7 leaders have secretly followed a pact that they will not create such kind of tribunal, in a while at least. So it's a question who we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. I now look to a speaker who is not on the order paper, but has very ably agreed to stand in for the aforementioned imprisoned speaker. I'm very happy to call upon the Press and Sponsorship Officer, Lincoln College, Sultan Kahar. Here.
So despite my experiences with elections that Maya so helpfully told you about, I'm going to prove to you tonight that even in the proposition's best, most fantastical inspired case where benevolent powers march against terrible despotic regimes, the very nature of an outside power taking violent action, fighting, for these ideals of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law is inherently dubious, shady, and questionable at best, or racist, supremacist, and morally bankrupt at its worst. Essentially, I will be arguing that no state has a right to impose itself and its desired political framework upon another, and that to do so violates the sovereignty and basic rights to freedom of to do so violates the basic rights to sovereignty and freedom of entire nations and peoples. Finally, I will be proving to you that even if it were acceptable to impose oneself in this way, we in the West are in no position to assume the role of the morally upright custodians of global peace and justice. So to fight a native force in order to install democracy in their state is supremely undemocratic. If we take democracy to mean a form of government where the people of a given society have a right to deliberate on legislation or decide upon governing officials to do so on their behalf, then any actions which seeks to impose something contrary to the will of these people must be considered undemocratic. Any subsequent authority that is instated as a result of this action thus immediately lacks legitimacy and has no mandate to rule, under the principles of democracy itself. It is not government by the people, nor for the people, rather it is government by some other, for some other. Unless a military invasion of a sovereign state has the goodwill to ask the local population for permission to blow their homes to smithereens, such an intervention has no mandate from the local population, no authority, and thus no right to intervene at all. In 2004, for instance, a year on from the invasion, 92% of Iraqis felt the coalition forces should leave. That doesn't sound like permission to me. But let's suppose for a moment that we forgive the proponents of undemocratic democracy for their poorly hidden hypocrisy, and Operation Get Rich of Oil, freedom is a go. Our would-be invader must now contend with the issue of cultural relativism. The proposition relies on the premise that democracy and individual liberty, as we imagine them, are inherently and universally effective and popular systems. But this is not true. These are Western ideas that have been born and cultivated in Western societies. Exporting these ideas is not a clean and straightforward process, nor is it often a popular one. To truly believe that fighting for democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law abroad is a noble and valiant pursuit, we must also accept that our way of life, our beliefs and ideas about society are inherently and intrinsically superior to those of others, those that we invade. To wage a war of democracy, the hypocrisy is in the name, we must accept that other cultures that do not align with our conceptions of law or justice are wrong, that they are inferior because they live in a way that isn't up to scratch with our ideas. If you're prepared to accept these things, then by all means walk through... not right now. If you're prepared to accept these things, then by all means walk out through that door labeled eyes. But if you are able to recognize that this blatant expression of imperialism is imperialism and nothing more, then there is only one way that you should vote tonight. But again, let's forget for a moment that about whether invading another state and fighting for democracy or individual liberty is justifiable and these questions. Let's indulge the make-believe of the proposition and imagine that there is nothing wrong with invasion and imperialism. Why do we get to do it? What makes us, in the West, so qualified to masquerade as the world's police? Are we really the righteous guardians of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law here in the United Kingdom or the United States? Now, as Maya told you earlier, I was a substitute for this debate, and I have to confess that I slightly ran out of time when writing this, so I hope you'll forgive me for reverting to the words of Sacha Baron Cohen in The Dictator. I want you to imagine if America was a dictatorship. You could let 1% of the people have all the nation's wealth. You could help your rich friends get richer by cutting their taxes, by bailing them out when they gamble and lose. You could ignore the needs of the poor for healthcare and education. Your media would appear free, but would secretly be controlled by one person. You could wiretap phones. You could torture foreign prisoners. You could have rigged elections. You could lie about why you go to war. You could use the media to scare people into supporting policies that are actually against their interests. I'm sure the Americans in the room probably can't relate. Imagine. Anyway, on a more serious note, when our own nations are laden with issues that include mass socioeconomic inequality, a crisis of distrust in political systems, fighting for loose, selective ideas of democracy abroad not only fails to make meaningful difference in those countries that we invade, but also neglects domestic issues, which then have negative repercussions that contribute to internal unrest and instability. We breed and create instability, chaos, and violence in a nation that never asked for it, and we exacerbate issues at home as well. To conclude then, I would like to remind the House of precisely what this motion entails. To fight for democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law abroad. We fight for democracy by forcing a system of governance that is declared superior upon a population that has not asked for it and that does not want it. We fight for individual liberty by silencing these people and hurling them into a program of rebuilding that is financially crippling, breeds irresolvable social instability, and paves the way for exploitative leaders to come to power. And we fight for the rule of law by reducing what once could have been a proud nation with a rich culture and history to a defeated pile of rubble and dust, its legal system shattered, and justice in chaos. So if you are on the side of oppression, exploitation, and destruction, then vote with the proposition. But if you are truly on the side of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, then you must vote with the opposition tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sultan, for that fine speech. We're now at the point of the debate where we look for speakers from the floor, and I look for a member to give a speech to propose the motion tonight, and I select the chair of the Harvard Political Union, Theo Harper. Here.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is an immense honour and privilege to speak before this august body. To begin, I would like to make two brief notes. First, the people of Ukraine and the people of Taiwan have asked for intervention, and they do want it. And second, contrary to what the proposition says, and second, when the opposition tells you about the evil dictatorships in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Indonesia in the 1990s and the terrible crimes committed by the Kosovoan People's Army, I agree. Those were wrong, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the motion to defend democracy, to support those groups. If they want to oppose those groups, they should join side proposition. But what I would really like to note is that we as a nation have a purpose. We as a nation have a point that makes us different from our friends across the channel in France. We as a nation have a reason to be, and that is that we are the oldest democracy, that we are the defender of civil liberties, and whether you like it or not, that is something we stand for. So I believe that when you believe in defending democracy, you should take action. And the naysayers on the other side, like your president, may say, oh, we do not have the capacity to intervene. We do not have the capacity to brashly intervene, I believe he put it. That is true. We are not an empire anymore, but we do have an ability to make an impact, and the Americans do have an ability to intervene. And that is something we should embrace. We should be willing to stand up for what we believe in. We should, rather than just using the words that say that we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, we should actually be willing to put our actions into purpose and intervene. And so I would leave you with this. Behind me, you will see a statue of the Lord Salisbury. He is famous for saying that or for implementing a policy of splendid isolation. On the other side are his modern protégés, the believers in splendid isolation. But when you go through those doors, you will turn your backs on him. I encourage you to embrace that. I encourage you to accept that and turn your backs on splendid isolation too.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. I now look for a speaker in opposition, and I select the ex-Senior Access Officer, Pembroke College. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a debate about whether or not democracy is good. Of course it can be, in many ways, in many contexts. Nor is this a debate about whether or not we stand with the people in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, in Eastern Europe under the USSR. Because these were folks who were not fighting for democracy abroad. They were fighting for democracy back home, where they are today. Against those who dare trample upon their sovereignty, we stand with them and we support them. No problem there. What this debate is, however, is about foreign military interventions, putting troops on the ground, dropping drones on thousands of innocent civilians that you point to as collateral damage, Kissinger. That these are ultimately the acts of those who hide behind the veil of democracy to justify the prosecution of interventionist campaigns. We heard a lot of examples from both sides of the House tonight. How do you judge? And what are you going to do when you walk out of this very room? I don't think a debate can be won or lost on a basis of examples. I think it's looking at reasons. And a question of reasons that ought to compel us to believe in voting for or against the motion. What I want to show with the following reasons is that foreign military interventions backed by the West are more likely than not to any failure for 4 to 5 different reasons. The first is a law of unintended consequences. Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah to some extent, let's say, ISIS, and also the Taliban, the commonality across the Republic are pretty unpleasant people. It's a fact that all of them derive benefits from Western arms, Western aid, Western equipment and capital in name of democracy. Second observation, mission creep and overreach. Let's look at the Iraq War as an example. When it first went there, there was weapons of mass destruction like that, clearly told me weapons there, and then it became, oh, we want to build a state there. Oh, we don't want to build a state there. Oh, we do want to build a state there. Okay, forget about it. Let's talk about jobs. Let's do more on drugs instead. 5 years. Then, okay, drugs didn't work out. Let's talk human rights. What about that? You know what? We failed. Let's fail. That is the reality of mission creep. We get way over rule of law in the theoretical realm of ideals we want. But the practice is, and this is the final reason, we cannot count on the intrinsically arbitrary whims of democracies to sustain a coordinated effort to build democracies. What happened in Vietnam? Let's not forget that. What happened when the troops pulled out? It was not a democratic state that flourished in the aftermath of the war in Vietnam. It was not. It was instead body bags, disrupted, terminated lives, American soldiers sent to die on the fields, and a state that was never built, and mistakes that swept under the carpet. That is side proposition. So proud to oppose today. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that very fine speech. I now look to another speech to propose the motion, and I look to the member there.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I found it ironic that the previous speaker said that he was going to argue in reasons, yet he only used examples. He said that he was not going to be using examples. That's something to consider. I'm sorry if I feel winded or appear winded. I spent the last day at the rowing, and it is clearly affecting me. I think we should consider this motion in a realistic way. It's not likely that any Western state is going to commit to any further military expansions just because it's not very popular and we don't have any money and it's looking like it's not something that's going to happen. I don't think that there's any Alexander the Great in any Western power who wants to sweep through all the authoritarian countries in the world. So I don't think that this is necessarily what side proposition needs to be on the side of. I think what this debate really should come down to is how do we think about the decisions we make in politics and foreign policy? Do we consider our values? Do we consider whether we are supporting or opposing authoritarianism in the things that we do? In response to Professor Zunes, it almost sounded like he should be on side proposition because he talks about the hypocrisy that many Western states have in that they support authoritarian regimes. So clearly the West is not doing this side. And so if they were to do this side, they would do things like putting sanctions on them, like cutting military aid to them. I think that this is a part of fighting for democracy, is engaging in these kinds of actions. It's not realistic to assume that any sort of fighting necessarily has to mean a military intervention. Lastly, before I sit down, I want to tell a little thing about a friend of mine who is not a rich person. He's just like a graduate student, my age. He's from Ukraine, and he is fighting for democracy, not as a soldier, but as raising money. He personally, despite his limited resources, was able to donate 500 bulletproof vests to the Ukrainian army. I think that this is a part of fighting for democracy. It's something that's disadvantaging him because he doesn't have very much money, but it's something that he's doing as part of the fight. So even if you are a small country or a person without many resources, fighting for democracy is something that you can do. It may be outside of our capability at the moment to soldiers to Ukraine, but we still can do things to help. And that is something that is obviously the case that we should do. In response to the last opposition speaker, I don't think that there's anything necessarily imperialist about this. I think that when it is imperialist, we should not do it, and when it is the right thing to do, when it so often the case is, then we obviously have to. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. I now look to a final speaker to oppose the motion from the floor, and I recognise the member there on the access bench. Here.
So let's start with the first speaker, the one from Cambridge, the wrong one. Let me say that the motion does not say to defend, but to fight for. This is an important difference. So what is our mandate to fight war abroad? Under the democratic president, Barack Obama, there's been a record number of strikes in Syria and other states. What is our mandate? To execute people abroad. How possibly can a power usurpate the sovereignty of another state to invade it, to impose its own will, and to actually kill somebody in another country without even asking for permission? And this is mere imperialism. It's simply building an empire, and it is what the US is doing, now being worried by the action of China, which is merely building another empire. So what we are seeing is the return of a Cold War, this time between the US and China, and what is the benefit that this invasion has brought to country. So first of all, let me start by saying, for which democracy is the US fighting for? A democracy in which, in the US, lawmakers cannot even agree to raise the debt ceiling. A democracy in which judges are named by the president and ratified by Congress. A democracy in which the head of the vice president sits at the head of the Senate. So first of all, a democracy with no division of power. This is American democracy. Second, the US has never been shy of being friendly with authoritarian government, be it Saudi Arabia or the other many Gulf countries with which the US entertains very friendly and cordial relations. And then the last point I want to raise is how has the US actually treated allies? Spying on Germany, using Italy as a launch pad in the past. This is what the US done, just exercising imperialism. And so in terms of what is the bonus of this invasion? The US has managed to crumble national pride when it let people loot the National Museum in Baghdad. It has done the same in other countries. And what I want to say is that these policies only serve one purpose, having a perennial war, because as Cicero once said, in time of war, the law is silent, and the Patriot Act is, I think, a very eloquent example. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech and for all floor speakers. The floor prize goes to the first speaker in opposition, and I remind all floor speakers that they would be most welcome to attend President's Drinks in the Gladstone Room after the debate. We must, however, with great pleasure, return to the speakers on the paper, and with that I call upon Ambassador John Bolton to conclude the case for the proposition here.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let's be clear. This resolution does not advocate war. It instead addresses the hard and persistent question of how to advance our interests and values successfully short of war, and how, when the prospect of military force looms, what role our values play in the calculus of national policy. The preamble of NATO's founding document, the Treaty of Washington, embodies these principles, clearly stating that the parties, quote, are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. What a remarkable treaty that is. And what a remarkable record. The most successful, sustained political-military alliance in human history, with new members knocking on the door even as we speak. Defending these values clearly implies a willingness to fight for them, not because we seek military conflict, but because the willingness and capability to do so are vital to create structures of deterrence, which convince adversaries the aggression is not worth the price they will pay. The ancient Romans described this strategy as si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Ronald Reagan called it peace through strength. Nonetheless, today in the United States, we see the virus of isolationism reemerging among people who have not only lost track of geostrategic reality, they've lost track of our own civilization. You have heard the virus of isolationism in this room tonight. In many respects, tonight's resolution is debated throughout the West. I focus on America because that's where this debate must be won most decisively. In America, there is a perpetual tension over whether pursuing our national interest or defending our values lies at the heart of our foreign policy. America is not a country that emerged from a lengthy historical past, but one founded on protecting key values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that our founding fathers committed their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. In fact, the most important democracy, individual, and liberty and rule of law which America must defend are its own. At a very basic level, Americans, rightly or wrongly, always hope there is no disjunction between their interests and their values. Much of what the United States seeks to avoid in the wider world are threats to the principles foundational to our way of life. We are not defending an ethnicity, a religion, or an ancient culture, but a set of ideals. America struggles, frankly, when its values and interests do not align, or where its interests are too remote from crises where its ideals are in jeopardy. We must, and we do, acknowledge the reality that we are not able to police our values everywhere because we simply have no palpable interest in many places. Undoubtedly, however, we do our best when interest and values align, as when we stepped in to save the West 3 times in the 20th century, in 2 hot wars and 1 Cold War. Today, no one can pretend that geography alone determines what are and what are not vital interests. Even while warning us in his 1796 farewell address, George Washington said then to have with foreigners as little political connection as possible. But he fully understood U.S. interest would enlarge and diversify as time passed. National security strategy, necessary at the beginning, was not permanent. Washington said, "The period is not far off when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel." With me, a predominant motive has been to endeavor to gain time to our country, necessary to give it the command of its own fortunes. America's values are anti-totalitarian values. By contrast, the common attributes of this century's rogue states, whether superpowers or not, are 1, they support terrorists or themselves engage in state terrorism. 2, they pursue weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological. And 3, they oppress their own people. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea all meet these menacing standards. Clearly, the basic elements of their policies are utterly antagonistic to U.S. ideals and those of NATO's charter. In the 20th century's major existential wars, America's interests and its values were closely aligned, respecting our critical goals and objectives. In World War I, the United States was deeply split before it committed to its first land war in Europe. After the war, erecting a memorial in the 1920s, my alma mater inscribed these words: "In memory of the men of Yale, who, true to her traditions, gave their lives that freedom might not perish from the earth." Anno Domini 1914-1918. That tells you what Americans felt was at stake in World War I. World War II speaks for itself, the quintessential joinder of interest and values. The greatest generation conclusively defeated the Nazi tyranny and Japanese militarism. So I was struck in listening to the opposition lament the fact that after crushing Japan and Germany, they once again became dictatorships. What did I miss? So conclusive was the victory in 1945 that if anyone had thought of it, they would have declared it the end of history. Unfortunately, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and their fellow communists had other ideas. And the 20th century's third decisive war, the Cold War, ensued, another colossal struggle where America's values and interests were almost entirely aligned. Now, those who claim that this history so far is a case of particularly American imperialism, I just urge you to consider the words I often heard from my former boss, Colin Powell. The only land we ever asked for was land to bury our dead. Let me stress here that isolationism's contemporary resurgence in America rests partly on the perception that too many allies are free riders. There is also a larger point here. We can't want your individual freedoms more than you do. In World War II, when Britain stood alone against the Nazi death machine, Churchill said that Britain, quote, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time the new world with all its power and might steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. Now, hopefully, that remains true. But for Europe and much of the rest of the world, Churchill's optimism depends on how the ongoing American debate about isolationism turns out. Tell Americans, often enough, that they are unwanted, and there will come a point when God's good time doesn't come at all. The point where Americans will say, the next time you are threatened by a belligerent, authoritarian nation, do let us know how it turns out. Today, there are any number of areas where the West values and interests coincide. In the Western Hemisphere, for example, there are the cases where helping to reduce threats from external totalitarian societies, as well as liberate oppressed people, greets us in both Venezuela and Cuba. In Venezuela, no one asked us to fight to overthrow the Chavez-Maduro dictatorship, but it's tragic that we and our other coalition partners couldn't even give enough assistance to free the people of Venezuela, who remain oppressed politically and crushed economically. And in Cuba, I will just say briefly that we will ultimately bring the Castro brothers' dictatorship, a true fossil of the Cold War, out of power and back into the control of the people. The second category is where, thank you, I don't have enough time for applause. The second category is where NATO values support efforts to foreclose global terrorist threats or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Unquestionably, the most recent tragic abandonment of NATO values was in Afghanistan, where we fought against terrorism, not to impose Western values, as Fawzia Koofi has so eloquently said. The Trump-Biden withdrawal decision was one of the most catastrophic mistakes in American national security history, and an obvious tragedy for the Afghan people. It reflects isolationism's most recent success in America, and it provides evidence how increased isolationism would play out around the world. I'm very confident about what we did twice in Iraq, expelling Iraq from Kuwait in 1991, and in taking the Saddam Hussein's dictatorial, weapons of mass destruction-seeking terrorist regime and burying it and him. In Iran today, the insurgency against the Ayatollahs following the murder of Mahsa Amini, and now many others, makes one thing clear. This regime is weaker than at any point since 1979, and those who defend its continued existence, and therefore its terrorism and pursuit of nuclear weapons, will ultimately feel only shame for so doing. The third category is where NATO's values are shared geographically, militarily, or economically by critically important states. This is where we are most threatened. And first and foremost is in Ukraine, where we're not being asked to fight, but only to supply intelligence, weapons, and economic support. This is a time of truth for NATO. Key members like Germany and France must now shoulder their responsibilities. We welcome the decisions of Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Obviously, rejecting the alliance, mesdames et messieurs, that the alliance has become brain dead. And we should be appalled that incredibly some NATO members tilt toward Russia. I can assure you that in America, we remember the 1956 Hungarian Revolution against Moscow, even if the current government of Hungary does not. This is a strategic war for NATO, not just against Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, but what it says to Beijing's leaders. The wrong outcome in Ukraine will spell trouble all along China's Indo-Pacific periphery. China and Russia have decided on a partnership without limits and now constitute a new threatening axis capable of operating not merely on a regional, but on a global basis. Taiwan is most immediately threatened. South Korea and Japan now appreciate the threats they face, which is why Japan has committed to double its defense spending. And let's not forget Israel, the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, threatened by a nuclear holocaust from Iran. We will stand with Israel. So how internationally do we reconcile these values of interest? First of all, we must remember Winston Churchill's admonition about the confirmed unteachability of mankind. How many mistakes have we made that we must avoid repeating? I think one intriguing response to tonight's resolution is to make it global. Former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar suggested over 15 years ago to make NATO a worldwide alliance. We could admit, among others, Japan, Australia, Singapore, and Israel for starters. Many more would be interested. This is not the time to resile from values which have sustained us successfully for so long because international challenges are rising. To the contrary, these are precisely the circumstances where we should reaffirm and extend their reach. I cannot conclude without reminding you of the implications of losing this debate, not just in the vote here tonight, but in the ongoing debate over isolationism in the United States. You've heard numerous complaints and criticisms of the United States here this evening, and I don't doubt you hear them from your Oxford professors. I heard them from mine at Yale. But just remember this. If today's American isolationists come to dominate our foreign policy, in effect erasing America's support for the principles we are debating tonight and that have guided us for so long, you will miss us when we're gone. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton, for that very fine speech. I now look to Ambassador Peter Galbraith to conclude the case for the opposition and indeed the debate tonight. Hear, hear.
Mr. President, I became a member of this society in 1973. And so it is with some trepidation that I tonight give my maiden speech. I have listened to the proponents and to the opponents, and I'm afraid there's a great deal to obscure the issue. I say to my Estonian friend, I agreed with every word you said. And to my Afghan friend, we were together in that country at a critical time in 2009. I served there. I agreed with what you had to say. But the proposition tonight is not, should we support democracy? Of course we should support democracy. The proposition is not, should we never fight? Yes, there are times we should fight, and we have fought successfully. I don't have to go back in the lifetime of anybody here. We did it successfully in the Balkans in the 1990s. The issue is, and to stop a genocide, the issue is, should we be fighting for democracy? That specific point of going to war. This is not supporting, it's fighting. And incidentally, it works a heck of a lot better when other people do the fighting. We should give the Ukrainians everything they need because they're doing the fighting and we are not. So that is an entirely different proposition. Now, I say to my friend John Bolton, and we've been friends and sometimes even in agreement, particularly on questions of Kurdistan, a small corner of the world of agreement. I say to him, the test has to be effectiveness. Great, what a wonderful thing to say about Cuba. We've been pursuing that policy for 65 years. You could have been born when we started to get rid of the Castro brothers, and you would be getting your pension now. Whatever you could say about our policies toward Cuba, they haven't worked. And that, my friend, is the only question that concerns whether we should be fighting for democracy. The test has to be, is it effective? And let's be clear. When we talk about fighting for democracy, we're not talking about fighting alongside democracies. Yes, we did that in World War II. We weren't fighting for democracy, we were fighting for survival. And we did that in the Gulf War I. We sure as hell weren't fighting for democracy when we liberated Kuwait. We were fighting for the rules-based international order. So that's just not an issue. I can really only think of two major wars that were fought for democracy. Both were wildly expensive in terms of money and did not produce democracy. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrate why it is not feasible to fight for democracy outside the West. Nothing to do whether it's desirable, simply feasible. Let's consider what happened in Afghanistan. First, it didn't begin as a war for democracy. It began as a war to destroy Al-Qaeda, the organization behind the 9/11 attacks, and to oust the Taliban. And that goal was accomplished within a couple of months. U.S. Special Forces entered Afghanistan in October of 2001, and the Taliban were gone by December. It was done at very low cost. A few some airstrikes, and again, a few special forces. Why did it work? Because the U.S. fought alongside a local partner, the Tajik-led Northern Alliance, and they did most of the fighting. But having accomplished that goal, what did the Bush administration do? It could have let the Northern Alliance sort things out with other Afghans, but no. In a display of hubris and ignorance, it decided that it would make Afghanistan into the kind of democracy it thought Afghanistan should be. So it brokered a constitution of Afghanistan, one of the most diverse countries ethnically and geographically in the world, that created a highly centralized government with all power concentrated in Kabul, and in Kabul, all power concentrated in the person of the president, who, of course, could only come from one ethnic group. And so what was the inevitable result? With so much power at stake in one person, a series of elections that were massively fraudulent, 2009, 2014, 2019, and then we pretended it was democracy. So what was it? A two-month war to defeat the Taliban became a 20-year war for democracy. A low-cost operation ended up costing $2.1 trillion, according to Brown University, with thousands of NATO's deaths and hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives lost. Do I need to ask how it turned out? Well, let me tell you my little experience in Afghanistan. I first visited Afghanistan on February 14th, 1989, in a trip arranged by your former president with the Mujahideen, the people fighting against the Soviet-backed puppet regime. Now, what was special about that day? It was the day the Soviets withdrew. And what happened after the Soviets withdrew? The Soviet-backed puppet regime lasted 3 more years, a year longer than the Soviet Union itself. Now, what about the American-backed democratic regime in Afghanistan? Well, that one, after having spent $200 billion on an army, security forces of 200,000, that fell to 60,000 Taliban fighters in pickup trucks with mounted machine guns. It fell 2 weeks before the American withdrawal was completed. You can't imagine anything that better illustrates the folly of wars to fight for democracy outside of the West. Oh, except possibly for, oh yes, Iraq. 20 years after invading Iraq, troops are still there, US troops. A war with the stated purpose of eliminating non-existent weapons of mass destruction morphed almost immediately into an effort to create in Iraq a Western-style free market democracy whose examples would transform the Middle East. After toppling Saddam, the United States and the United Kingdom set up a coalition provisional authority to run and remake Iraq, staffed by recruits from the right-wing Heritage Foundation and places like it. The CPA was full of people with lots of ideas of democracy and free markets. Too bad they didn't have anybody who knew anything about Iraq, had ever served there, about the Middle East, or even about post-conflict situations. They passed 100 laws in the 15 months. They had all these programs for democracy, and guess what happened when Iraqis went to the polls? And they went to polls in indisputably free and fair elections in January of 2005. They didn't vote for any of the multi-ethnic parties that we wanted. The Kurds voted for Kurdish nationalist parties whose agenda was to get out of Iraq, and still is, and it should be. And they voted for Shiite religious parties closely associated with Iran. In fact, one of them, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, you kind of get a clue from the name that it wasn't like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Labor Party. You know, that was their agenda. And today, what is Iran's closest ally in the entire world? Why, it's Iraq. Okay, that's democracy. But really, was it worth now $3 trillion? And the loss of more than 8,000 NATO fighters to hand Iran a foreign policy success that it had fought 8 years to achieve in the Iran-Iraq war? But again, I'm not against intervention. In the 90s, and I disagree with my dear friend here, the US intervened twice in the Balkans. In 1995, we used a combination of airstrikes and diplomacy to end a genocidal war in Bosnia, then followed it up with the deployment of 35,000 NATO troops. In 1999, we used air power to oust Serbia from Kosovo, and then troops to facilitate the transition to what eventually became an independent country. You know what the cost of those two operations were? Bosnia and Kosovo? $30 billion combined. How many NATO soldiers died? How many American soldiers? Anybody know? The answer is 0. So what's the difference? How could these interventions work and the others be so disastrous, aside from the fact that I was involved in those and Bolton and the others? It's quite simple. Western interventions in the Balkans supported local parties to accomplish their objectives, ending genocide in Bosnia, independence in the case of Kosovo, and unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not reshape the fight to impose our ideas of democracy. And so it is with Ukraine. Although Ukraine is a democracy, our fight in the West fight is not, first, the West is not fighting in Ukraine for democracy. The West isn't fighting in Ukraine at all. And the fight is actually not about democracy. It's about helping the Ukrainian people resist an illegal aggression by Russia. And with our help, the Ukrainians have done amazingly well. So we certainly don't want to screw it up by sending in our own troops. Now, while I oppose this motion to fight for democracy, we can and should support democracy everywhere. But I'm sorry to say, the US and the West are very inconsistent on this point. The Nixon administration plotted to overthrow the democratically elected government of Chile because they didn't like what the Chilean people had chosen. When Pinochet overthrew him, he was embraced by the Reagan administration. My friend John Bolton was part of that. And when finally he was ousted, who was it that was trying to save him from being prosecuted in Spain, a European democracy, for murdering Spanish citizens? Why, the lobbyist was none other than Margaret Thatcher. And the Reagan administration, it supported South Africa's apartheid regime, vetoing congressional sanctions on South Africa and designated the African National Congress's military wing to be a terrorist organization. The people actually who were fighting for democracy in South Africa. And closer to home for this body, and very personal for me, the Reagan administration tried to obstruct my efforts to get Benazir Bhutto out of brutal imprisonment in a Class C cell in Sucker Desert in 1981. They even prohibited US diplomats from speaking to the Bhutto family. It was better, Reagan judged, for America to keep in the good graces of Pakistan's brutal dictator, Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, than to save the life of the leader who was trying to restore democracy in Pakistan. And this pattern continues to this day. On September 25th, 2017, in one of the most democratic, possibly the most democratic election ever held in the Middle East, the people of Iraqi Kurdistan voted 93% for independence, with close to 90% participation. And how did the Trump administration respond to this? They allowed Abu Mahdi Mohandas, a man who was actually convicted of blowing up the US Embassy in Kuwait in 1984, they allowed him and his militia in an operation directed by Qasem Soleimani to use American Abrams tanks to attack the Kurds who had just voted in a democratic election and who were America's friends in the Middle East. I dare say America's most reliable friends in the Middle East. And I know that John Bolton and I agree on this point, so I can't hold. And he was not part. There was a few bright moments when he was National Security Advisor. It went bad before and bad after. And I won't discuss, because several people have made it, the ongoing effort to ingratiate ourselves with Mohammed bin Salman. Who's this? The de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. You know, the war in Yemen that's claimed 350,000 lives, who shook down the members of the royal family for billions, who invited the Prime Minister of Lebanon, the elected Prime Minister of Lebanon, to Saudi Arabia, imprisoned him and forced him to resign, and who ordered the murder of an American journalist in the Turkish consulate in Istanbul and for his body to be cut in pieces. So before we decide to fight for democracy, let's begin by merely standing up for democracy. finally. And my father, who gave many speeches, said you should always use finally in his speech, especially at this time of night, because it gives your audience hope. We don't need to go to the far corners of the world to fight for, to find imperiled democracies for which we can fight. We could start with the United States. I served as the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, a formerly communist country, then trying to make the transition from dictatorship to democracy. Part of my job as an American diplomat was to give lectures on democracy. I would be embarrassed to do so today. Two of the essential features of a successful democracy are, one, an independent judiciary that can be relied upon to settle political disputes in a nonpartisan manner, and two, political parties that accept the results of elections they lose. Neither of these essential features of democracy exist in the United States today. A defining characteristic of a nonpartisan judiciary is this. Faced with identical law and identical facts, a nonpartisan court, a real court, will come to the same decision without regard to the political party of the plaintiff or of the defendant. But that's not true of the US judiciary. In a decision in December of 2000, and John Bolton was part of that, the US Supreme Court decided 5-4 to halt the Florida recount when George Bush was a few hundred votes ahead of Al Gore and in effect handed him the presidency. No serious person believes those 5 Republican Supreme Court members would have taken the same decision if Gore had been a few hundred votes ahead of Bush. And since 2000, the Supreme Court has become more partisan, more extreme right-wing, more an instrument of the Republican Party. 1 minute, John, I'll come back to you.
Would you have understood it to be the wrong result if the court had said, stop the recount earlier because they're violating the Constitution, which is fundamentally what
They had nothing to do with the Constitution. You mean the other 4 justices, incidentally 2 of whom were appointed by Republican presidents, they were against the Constitution. This was an entirely partisan exercise to put the guy they wanted in on the court. I'll come back to you. And then there was January 6th. We'll come to, you want to talk about January 6th? Let's.
denial, which is what you've just done.
January 6th. As bad as it was, storming the US Capitol, that wasn't the worst thing that happened on January 6th. It was that a majority of the Republicans in Congress, that is a majority of the Republicans elected to national office in the United States, voted to overturn an election that was indisputably free and fair, that Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. And let's be clear, American democracy in 2020 was not saved by the courts or the Congress, but rather by the incompetence of Donald Trump and the gang of clowns like Rudy Giuliani. In 2024, the anti-democracy gang in America will be much better prepared. In a case out of North Carolina, the Supreme Court appears poised to overturn 2 centuries of US voting by saying that gerrymandered Republican state legislatures are entitled to ignore the vote in their states and appoint their own electors. Had such a decision been handed down and before the 2020 election, Donald Trump and not Joe Biden would be US president today. So let me say, rather than looking for authoritarian dragons to slay far from home, Americans should be fighting to save our democracy at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that fine speech. And thank you to all contributors in what has been an absolutely exceptional debate. I think it does justice to Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday. Before we move the motion before the House, I'd like to remind everyone that it's imperative to stay seated until myself, the officers, and the guest speakers had left the chamber. But now, to move the motion put before the House tonight, I move that this House would fight for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad. Please vote with your feet. And with that, I remain Matthew Dick, Magdalen College, and your President.